Daiju Takase weighs 169 pounds. Emmanuel Yarbrough, 600 pounds. Oh my God.
There are size mismatches in combat sports. And then there is this. One man weighed more than 600 pounds. The other weighed just 169. When Emmanuel Yarbrough stepped into the ring, he didn't look like a normal fighter. He looked like something impossible. At nearly 7 feet tall and weighing well over 600 pounds, Yarbrough was one of the largest athletes to ever compete in combat sports. Standing across from him was Daiju Takase, a much smaller and faster mixed martial artist who looked tiny by comparison. The visual difference between the two men was so extreme that the fight almost seemed fake. It looked less like a professional contest, and more like a real-life video game boss battle. Fans watching for the first time could barely believe what they were seeing. Yarbrough outweighed Takase by more than 400 pounds. One mistake from the smaller fighter could mean getting trapped underneath an avalanche of human weight, with no way to escape. At first glance, the outcome seemed obvious. How could someone that small possibly survive against a man that enormous? But mixed martial arts has always had a way of exposing uncomfortable truths. Because fighting is not just about size. It is about movement, conditioning, technique, control, and perhaps most importantly, endurance. What made this matchup so fascinating was that both fighters represented opposite extremes of combat sports. Yarbrough embodied raw physical intimidation. His sheer presence alone was enough to make people uncomfortable. Every movement looked dangerous because of the massive force behind it. Takase represented the complete opposite. Mobility over mass, technique over intimidation, efficiency over brute force. And as the fight began, it quickly became clear that this was not going to play out like most people expected. The opening moments were tense and chaotic. Yarbrough charged forward with frightening aggression, trying to use his massive frame to corner the much smaller Takase before he could settle into a rhythm. The crowd understood immediately what the danger was. If Yarbrough got on top of him, the fight might be over instantly. But Takase stayed calm. He circled. He moved. He forced the giant man to chase him. And slowly, the reality of the situation began to change. Because carrying 600 pounds inside a fight is not just an advantage. It is also a burden. Every step drains energy, every missed movement costs stamina, and every second becomes more exhausting than the last. What started as one of the most intimidating sights in MMA history gradually transformed into one of the strangest lessons the sport has ever produced. A lesson that proved something fans still debate today. How much does size really matter in a fight? This is the story of one of the craziest mismatches in combat sports history. The 600-pound giant versus the 169-pound fighter. To understand why this fight became so legendary, you first have to understand just how unbelievable Emmanuel Yarbrough really was. Even in the chaotic early years of mixed martial arts, where almost anything seemed possible, Yarbrough looked unreal. At over 600 pounds, he was not just bigger than most fighters. He was bigger than almost every athlete people had ever seen compete professionally in any combat sport. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with an enormous frame shaped by years of sumo wrestling, Yarbrough entered every arena looking less like a human fighter and more like a moving wall. Crowds did not react to him the way they reacted to normal athletes. They stared. Some laughed in disbelief. Others looked genuinely uncomfortable. Because seeing a man that large inside a fighting ring triggered something primal. The size difference alone made every matchup feel dangerous before the fight had even started. And that was exactly why promoters loved him. During the 1990s, mixed martial arts was still evolving. The sport had not yet settled into the modern structure fans recognize today. There were fewer weight classes, fewer restrictions, and far more experimental matchups. The entire appeal of early MMA revolved around answering impossible questions. Could a boxer beat a wrestler? Could a karate fighter defeat a grappler? Could technique overcome brute strength? And perhaps the biggest question of all, could a normal-sized fighter survive against someone monstrously larger? Yarbrough became one of the ultimate experiments in that idea. At the beginning, Yarbrough looked like an unstoppable force, while Takase appeared vulnerable. Now Yarbrough looked exhausted and increasingly helpless, while Takase looked fresh, mobile, and fully in control. The crowd could sense the momentum shifting. What had started as a frightening spectacle was becoming something else entirely. A demonstration, a proof of concept for modern mixed martial arts philosophy. Technique, conditioning, mobility, efficiency. These qualities were defeating impossible physical size in real time. And yet, even as Yarbrough struggled, there remained an unusual tension in the fight. Because despite the exhaustion, he was still enormous. One mistake could still change everything instantly. That lingering danger kept the audience emotionally invested until the very end. Even a tired 600-pound fighter remained physically terrifying. But now Takase had complete control over the pace. And once a giant opponent loses control of the pace in combat sports, the collapse usually becomes inevitable. At this stage of the fight, Emmanuel Yarbrough was no longer fighting just Daiju Takase. He was fighting exhaustion itself. And exhaustion is merciless. One of the most misunderstood aspects of combat sports is how quickly fatigue destroys everything a fighter relies on. Power disappears. Reactions slow. Decision-making collapses. Even basic coordination becomes difficult. Techniques that seem simple in training suddenly feel impossible once the body begins shutting down under pressure. For Yarbrough, those effects were magnified to an almost unbelievable degree. Every pound of extra body weight required oxygen. Every movement demanded energy. And by now, his body was consuming both at a terrifying rate. What made the situation especially brutal was that Takase understood exactly what was happening. He recognized that the giant's explosiveness had faded, and that the dangerous early storm was beginning to disappear. This was the turning point of the fight. Not a single dramatic knockout blow, not one decisive takedown, but the gradual collapse of a body that simply could not sustain the pace of real combat. And once that process started, Takase became increasingly confident. His movement grew sharper. His attacks became more frequent. He no longer looked like a fighter trying to survive. Now he looked like a fighter taking control. That psychological reversal was fascinating to watch. At the beginning of the fight, the crowd reacted every time Yarbrough moved forward. There was genuine fear surrounding his pressure because of what could happen if he caught Takase cleanly or managed to pin him down. But now the audience could sense the balance shifting. The giant no longer looked invincible. He looked vulnerable. For perhaps the first time in the fight, Yarbrough began reacting to Takase instead of the other way around. And that is one of the clearest signs that momentum has completely changed in combat sports. Takase continued doing exactly what had brought him success. He circled carefully, attacked from angles, and refused to stay stationary for long periods. He never gave Yarbrough a clean opportunity to fully grab hold of him or force his weight onto him. That discipline mattered enormously. Because despite his exhaustion, Yarbrough remained physically dangerous. Even fatigued, 600 pounds of mass can create chaos instantly. One stumble, one bad angle, or one failed escape could still have ended disastrously for the smaller fighter. Takase's respected that day throughout the entire fight, and that respect is part of what made his performance so intelligent. A lot of fighters in his position would have become reckless once they saw the larger opponent tiring. They would rush forward emotionally, hunting for a dramatic finish. But recklessness against a giant opponent is exactly how smaller fighters get caught. Takase stayed composed, patient, efficient. Every movement had purpose. Meanwhile, Yarbrough's physical condition continued deteriorating rapidly. His breathing became visibly heavier. His reactions slowed dramatically. At times, he looked almost frozen between exchanges because recovering from movement itself had become exhausting. And this revealed the fundamental problem with relying entirely on massive size in a real fight. Weight can create terrifying power, but weight also creates terrifying energy demands. Modern MMA fans are used to seeing conditioned heavyweights who train extensively for endurance. Fighters like Cain Velasquez or Stipe Miocic demonstrated how dangerous large athletes can become when they combine power with elite cardio. But Yarbrough represented the opposite extreme. His size had gone beyond functional athleticism, and once a fighter crosses that threshold, the body itself becomes the opponent. That is exactly what Takase exploited. The fight increasingly resembled a survival contest where one fighter was slowly drowning in exhaustion, while the other remained calm enough to capitalize. And yet, strangely, there was still something impressive about Yarbrough. Even as he tired, the visual impact of his size remained astonishing. Watching someone that enormous attempt to fight at all felt surreal. Every exchange looked physically unnatural because combat sports are simply not designed for athletes of that scale. It almost looked like two completely different worlds colliding inside one ring. One fighter represented mobility, technique, and modern combat efficiency. The other represented raw mass and intimidation taken to a nearly absurd level. That contrast is why the fight continues to fascinate people decades later. Not because it was technically beautiful. Not because it was a legendary back-and-forth war. But because it answered a question that many fans secretly wonder about. Could a giant simply overwhelm a much smaller skilled fighter through sheer size alone? For a few moments early in the fight, it looked possible. But now the answer was becoming painfully clear. No. Not if the smaller fighter remained disciplined enough to survive. And that realization changed the emotional tone of the fight completely. The fear surrounding Yarbrough slowly transformed into sympathy, because exhaustion at that level is brutal to watch. Every attempt to move looked difficult. Every recovery looked slower. And once a fighter reaches that stage physically, the body begins failing faster and faster. Takase sensed this and increased the pressure carefully, not recklessly, not wildly, but intelligently. His strikes became more confident as Yarbrough struggled to defend himself effectively. The giant's ability to react had deteriorated badly, and his balance became increasingly unstable during exchanges. The inevitability of the outcome started settling over the arena. The giant was running out of answers, and perhaps more importantly, he was running out of energy. This is one of the cruel truths of fighting that applies regardless of skill level or size. Once fatigue reaches a certain point, strategy barely matters anymore. The body stops cooperating. Techniques disappear, survival instincts take over. And against a composed opponent like Takase, that situation becomes almost impossible to reverse. Still, the crowd remained captivated because the visual absurdity of the matchup never stopped feeling unbelievable. Every second looked like something from a movie rather than a real sporting event. A 169-pound fighter controlling a 600-pound giant through movement and endurance alone. It felt impossible. But it was happening in real time. And by now, the final collapse felt close. By the final moments of the fight, the outcome no longer felt uncertain. Emmanuel Yarbrough had gone from looking terrifying to looking completely exhausted. The giant who had stormed forward with frightening pressure in the opening exchanges was now struggling just to stay active. And that transformation is what made the fight unforgettable. Not because the smaller man landed some miracle knockout, not because of a dramatic comeback, but because the fight exposed the exact moment where raw physical size stopped being an advantage and started becoming a weakness. Daiju Takase could see it clearly now. The reactions were gone. The explosiveness had disappeared. The pressure that once made the entire arena tense had faded into desperation. Yarbrough was simply too tired to continue fighting effectively. Takase stayed disciplined to the very end. Even with the giant slowing dramatically, he refused to make reckless mistakes. He continued circling, picking his moments carefully, and forcing Yarbrough to keep moving. And every second made things worse for the larger fighter. The exhaustion became overwhelming. At times, Yarbrough looked almost trapped inside his own body, unable to respond quickly enough as Takase attacked and escaped repeatedly. His movements had become painfully slow, and his ability to defend himself was deteriorating rapidly. Eventually, the referee had seen enough. The fight was stopped. And just like that, one of the strangest mismatches in combat sports history came to an end. The smaller fighter had survived the impossible, but more importantly, he had controlled the impossible. As Takase celebrated, the crowd reacted with a mixture of shock and fascination. People had tuned in expecting spectacle, maybe even chaos. Instead, they witnessed something far more interesting. A lesson. Because underneath the bizarre visuals and unbelievable weight difference, the fight revealed one of the core truths of mixed martial arts. Technique without conditioning eventually fails. Power without endurance eventually collapses. And size without mobility eventually becomes a burden. For years afterward, clips of the fight continued spreading across the internet because the matchup looked so absurd. New viewers often reacted the same way at first. They saw the size difference and assumed the giant would crush the smaller man instantly. Then they watched the fight. And slowly the reality became obvious. Combat sports are not static. A fight is not determined by size alone, because fighting requires constant movement, constant energy expenditure, and constant adaptation under pressure. The human body has limits, and once exhaustion pushes past those limits, even the most intimidating physical advantages begin disappearing. That is what happened to Yarbrough. For a brief period, he looked almost unstoppable, but sustaining that level of physical effort at over 600 pounds proved impossible. Takase understood this from the very beginning, and that is why his performance deserves far more respect than it usually receives. This was not simply a case of a giant getting tired. It was a smaller fighter executing a disciplined strategy under enormous psychological pressure. Takase had to remain calm while facing someone who outweighed him by hundreds of pounds. One mistake could have changed everything instantly. Yet he never panicked, never rushed, never abandoned the game plan. That composure won him the fight. And in many ways, it also helped shape how people viewed mixed martial arts going forward. For a brief moment, Emmanuel Yarbrough looked terrifying enough to overwhelm anyone. Watching him move forward in those opening exchanges felt genuinely dangerous. The possibility of seeing the smaller fighter trapped underneath that enormous frame created tension, unlike almost any normal MMA fight. And honestly, that fear was completely reasonable, because size absolutely matters in fighting. But this fight showed that size alone is never enough. Eventually, every fighter has to breathe, every fighter has to move, every fighter has to manage exhaustion. And once fatigue begins taking over, even the most frightening physical advantages can disappear shockingly fast. That is exactly what Daiju Takase understood from the beginning. He did not try to overpower the giant. He did not fight emotionally. He fought intelligently, patiently, disciplined from the opening seconds until the very end. And that discipline allowed him to survive one of the strangest matchups in MMA history and gradually turn the fight completely in his favor. In many ways, this bout became the perfect symbol of early mixed martial arts, an era where promoters tested impossible ideas, an era where nobody fully understood what worked yet, an era where combat sports still felt wild enough to ask outrageous questions and dangerous enough to let those questions play out in real time. Could a normal-sized fighter survive against someone 4 times heavier? This fight answered that question, not with a dramatic movie-style knockout, not with some impossible miracle, but with something far more realistic: movement, cardio, patience, technique, the fundamentals of fighting slowly breaking down the illusion of invincibility created by raw size. Today, the fight between Emmanuel Yarbrough and Daiju Takase remains one of the most bizarre spectacles the sport has ever produced. New fans continue discovering it online and reacting with the exact same disbelief people had decades ago. Because no matter how many times you see it, the matchup still feels unreal. A 600-pound giant chasing a fighter less than 1/3 his size, and somehow the smaller man surviving. Not just surviving, winning. And maybe that is why this fight continues to live on. Thanks for watching.